Hello, and welcome to episode 74 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Atlanta, Georgia, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Emily Parke, Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at the University of Auckland. Emily's research is centered in the philosophy of biology, general philosophy of science, bioethics, and environmental ethics. A lot of Emily's current work focuses on experimental microbiology, and in particular, microbiome causality, or the causal connections made between entire microbial communities and a wide array of traits that range from physiological diseases to psychological states. Emily is also interested in other areas of inquiry that challenge our ideas about life and its simplest forms. Emily is currently thinking, talking, and writing about philosophical issues in microbiome research, scientific modeling, astrobiology, and conservation biology. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Emily. Dr. Emily Parke, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well. How are you this afternoon?
I'm doing fine. And yeah, thank you for that. To our listeners, we're on quite the time difference. I'm reaching out to you from the Eastern time zone in the United States. And where are you calling us from?
From Auckland, New Zealand.
Ooh, wow. So how are things out in Auckland?
Pretty good. It's summer and the academic year is beginning in a few weeks. Still getting used to the calendar here. Yeah.
Very, very nice. Very nice. So on Auckland and in the summer calendar, when does the quarters of the terms typically take place?
Yeah, we end the academic year in October, early November, and then it's summer break, and then the new semester starts end of February, beginning of March.
Very nice, very nice. Well, I hope you had a pleasant break and sorts, and are ramping up for the new year. So I've spoken with a number of folks in terms of like what are things like at the university, given current state of things. What's been going on in Auckland?
We've been pretty lucky throughout the pandemic with having a couple of relatively short, hardcore lockdowns and then long periods without COVID. And it's just the last couple months that we're kind of having to catch up with the rest of the world with COVID cases. Okay. Mm-hmm. But yeah, right now we're teaching online for the first half of the semester, which I was hoping not to have to do again, but we'll see how it goes. And then we're hoping to get back in person after that. Nice.
Excellent. What kind of courses will you be teaching this term?
I'm teaching Phil 100, which is Mind, Knowledge, and Reality, which I co-teach. So I do the knowledge bit and a bit of the reality bit, I guess.
Okay.
And then I'm co-teaching a graduate course in biology that I've co-taught with my colleague James Russell, who's a conservation biologist. So this will be our 4th or 5th year teaching it together. It's really fun. It's called Dialogues in Biology, and he started it out as mainly a course in conservation ethics. And since we started teaching it together, it's shifting towards, I think of it as like philosophy for biology grad students. So we do quite a bit of ethics, mostly around ecology and conservation, and a bit of kind of introductory issues in philosophy of science, thinking about science and objectivity, and then some of my favorite topics in Phil Bio. It's a lot of fun.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. It reminds me a bit. I recall studying briefly at Arizona State, and it was interesting that our HBS program was housed within the biology program, and there was a number of different conservation biologists and 4E people that were doing cool work. But it's really cool to hear co-teaching with a biologist. What are the grad bio students like?
Oh, they're awesome. And there was one time that we taught it that we sort of randomly ended up with like a quarter of the class having taken philosophy before, which was kind of interesting. But most of the time they've never even heard of academic philosophy or maybe taken one class in it. And it's just a lot of fun introducing them to philosophy and also to writing essays, because they're not used to having to write essays and argue for things the way philosophers do.
Right.
And it's been a fun teaching challenge for me to introduce them to that, because they're grad students, they have a lot of academic training,
of course,
but they might have never written an essay where they're supposed to make and defend an argument before. So it's different than teaching it to introductory philosophy students at the first year. But I find that a lot of fun, and they just love getting into discussions about the stuff.
Do any of them have any jumped ship yet? Have they come over to the philosophies? Or I imagine they're pretty steeped in their research. So, yeah.
Well, that's always my secret plan.
Right.
So, I have one that I'm co-supervising now, who's doing a master's in biology, but with philosophical aspects. I can't remember if he jumped ship before or after taking that class, but working
definitely.
on it.
I mean, so it happens, and it can go the other way around. I've known philosophers who wish they were biologists and vice versa, things like that. So
totally, yeah.
Great. Well, I hope it goes well. And that definitely seems like a course where, the kind of connections you really want to, I would hope to have in person, but I can understand the constraints. A scholar and a researcher like yourself doesn't necessarily just, come teaching philosophy, biology grad courses as a philosopher. And I imagine you've had quite a interesting series to get to where you are today. And so, let's take a step back. I'm really interested to hear, obviously I'm really excited to hear more about your research in the philosophy of microbiology, astrobiology, conservation ethics as well. But let's take a step back and figure out how we got to where we are today. So, Emily, why don't you tell us a little bit about where you grew up?
I grew up in Seattle in the 90s. It was a great place to be.
90s. That's like the 90s place. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I wore a lot of plaid shirts and torn jeans. Yep. I spent 4 years living in Pullman, Washington as a kid, while my dad became a veterinarian at Washington State University. And so I got to hang out with animals. It was like Dr. Dolittle for 4 years of my life, which was pretty cool. And then back to Seattle until I went to university at college at Reed in Oregon.
Reed, yeah. I've heard many good things. So it sounds like you had some interest early on in animals in general. So when going to Reed, what were you perhaps was philosophy on the radar at all, or were you have other interests you were considering?
Yeah, so I mean, partly because I was really, 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 really into animals as a kid. I was totally convinced I was going to be a biologist.
Okay.
And I liked biology in high school, but I went to a big public high school that didn't have, I was going to say it didn't have great education, which is not quite fair. There were some really great teachers, but let's just say I didn't learn a lot of science there, apart from the basics. And when I got to Reed, I enrolled as a biology major and enrolled in all the first year biology courses. And I was so excited about it. And I just did really terribly. I think I got a D in my first semester of biology.
Oh.
And then maybe a C the next time. And partly because it was a weeding out course and most of the other people had done like AP biology, but also I just was not, and still am not good at memorizing a bunch of stuff and taking tests about it. And so I got pretty demoralized by that.
That's what intro bio basically is. So
and then I think some people who come to philosophy of science have the same sort of story, but I ended up taking a philosophy of biology class. I don't think that was till my second year. So I took a couple of philosophy classes. I'd never heard of philosophy before. I had the, total like naive cliche idea that philosophy is just thinking a bunch of deep thoughts and coming up with catchy phrases about the meaning of life. But but I took logic first and I really liked it. And so I took philosophy of biology because I thought, oh, this has biology in the title and I still like biology. And I realized that those were actually the questions I was interested in. I just remember like the first week of the class, I was just thinking, yes, this is what I liked about biology.
Yeah. So to test the memory, I was curious if you can recall perhaps any of those initial questions that, or, themes, perhaps maybe just more broadly, that were initially kind of like, that initially you were drawn to in terms of the Phil Bio stuff.
Yeah, I actually, the things that I remember the most from that class are reading Gould's. And, like he says some controversial stuff and writes in quite an interesting way. And but his stuff about evolution as progress, I remember that was the thing that really grabbed me. And I think we read it pretty early on in that class. And just the idea that you could take this thing that everyone thinks is a fact about biology, or at least that had been my experience so far, and just challenge it so deeply and come up with this totally different idea. I was drawn to his writing at that point in my life, but also just that way of just coming in and saying, nope, let's think about this totally differently.
Fantastic. Okay. And so, I mean, was that it? Was it set, like going to do philosophy of biology? Would you say that would be?
Yeah, that would be a kind of nice, simple story. But I actually I actually ended up not feeling so good about philosophy by the end of my bachelor's. I really liked it, but I had kind of a challenging experience with my undergrad program. I was the only woman in most of my classes, and there weren't any women teaching in the faculty. And I think that had more of an impact on me than I realized at the time. But I ended my BA with a lot of imposter syndrome and feeling like this is fun, but I'm not very good at it. But I was really lucky to have this amazing undergrad mentor who I'm still really close to, Mark Bedeau, who's an awesome philosopher of biology who's written a lot about life and emergence. And so he supervised my senior thesis. And as I was finishing up, he was going to Europe on some kind of long-term leave to start this project, creating life from scratch, essentially. So it was part of one of these big European-funded consortiums. So he was collaborating with a bunch of scientists based in Venice, Italy, starting up this company trying to create protocells. So yeah, short version of the story is I bugged him to give me a job, and he wasn't sure if they'd have money for that sort of thing or not. And then a few months after I graduated, he got in touch and said, do you want to come work in Venice for a few months?
Really?
And yeah, so I went there for a few months, and it turned into almost 5 years, working with this group of scientists and a few philosophers trying to create life from basic chemicals. And I was kind of doing a bit of everything there, like helping run the company and order lab supplies and do sort of marketing research. And then we started organizing workshops on the social and ethical side of the research, because there's a lot of stuff on the ethics of synthetic biology, the sort of stuff that Craig Venter got famous for, taking existing life and modifying it in various ways. And what we were doing there was kind of different, creating life from the bottom up, literally stuff like soap and olive oil and water and mixing it together to try to make cells. So yeah, we did some talking and writing and workshop organizing focused around getting people to think about what are the sort of special ethical and other issues that arise with that more bottom-up approach, with the end goal of creating something living. And that got me interested in philosophy again, or maybe more, it made me realize that I actually my heart was in the philosophical questions. Yeah.
That's fascinating to me, this group that came together. So you mentioned working in various facets of the company. And so I guess I'm curious of, like, so what were what were the end goals of this project? And was there like a product to be had, or was there what was the and I guess what were the deliverables that you guys were hoping to produce?
So the bigger project, which was a consortium of 12 or 13 groups, was called PACE, which stood for Programmable Artificial Cell Evolution.
Okay.
And it was mostly people based at universities trying to better understand the origin of life by engineering it in the lab, or trying to think about what sorts of alternative chemistries could support life and how far we can kind of push the boundaries of life's basic chemistry. But yeah, the group I was part of was the only company involved. It was called Protolife. I think the grant funding specified that you had to have at least one company in addition to university people. It was run by Mark Badeau and Norman Packard, who's a scientist who's done a lot of stuff with complex systems. The company part of my job, I guess, was working with them and the rest of the team to try to figure out what the end product should be. So we were looking into artificial cells, like as drug delivery devices, or
I see.
What could we do with these things as a company? And it wasn't easy, especially as a bunch of academics running a company. But they ended up, there's a spin-off of it that's actually still going, because they ended up doing some quite cool stuff using evolutionary algorithms to optimize the chemistry in the lab. It's quite a long story, but it's pretty cool. I think the current iteration of it is called Daptics, and they're still working with labs to use algorithms to optimize what they do in the lab.
Yeah, as I'm looking up it online, I see Norman Packard and a little bit more of the previous, but Daptics, adaptive analytics. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, what a unique, this sounds okay. So how is it, I suppose, working in industry as a philosopher?
It was so fun. It was it was my first job after I basically went there straight from college. And it was just really exciting. I guess it was an industry job. It felt like quite a special time and place to be working, because there were like 5 of us when I started, and I think maybe 10 to 12 by the end when I left. But it was just this team of really interesting, fun, smart people, and also just being in a new country and learning a new language. And it was a great time in my life. It was a hard decision to leave, but I decided I wanted to do a PhD after that.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I can see. So after having this, great experience, going on to study at well-known University of Pennsylvania, who we've had a couple of folks on the show, like Weisberg, Quayshawn Spencer. How was your time in the PhD?
It was so great. It was fantastic. So Michael Weisberg was my supervisor. Quayshawn actually arrived within a year of when I left. I wish I got to overlap with him more. I had a really, really great time at Penn. I chose it mainly because of just the feel I got from the people there when I can't remember if they did an actual interview, but just when I spoke to Michael, and a couple of grad students reached out to me, and I remember just having this feeling that it would be a great community to be a part of, and it totally was. Michael was an amazing supervisor, and I came in wanting to work on the nature of life and sort of philosophy of astrobiology and synthetic biology, building on what I've been doing at Protolife. And I've actually kind of come back to that topic now. We can talk about that later if you want. But Michael gently, expertly steered me in the direction of a bit more of a kind of core philosophy of science topic, which I'm really glad I took all of his advice, but especially that bit, just as far as, digging into something that is a bit more resonant with what more philosophers of science care about for my thesis.
We're up to. Sure.
Yeah.
So I'll tell us a little bit about that then, and sort of, I suppose, briefly retiring those interests, but then focusing on, so at the time, what was this project, and the project you were, that others could perhaps resonate with, as well as yourself. And tell us a little about it.
Oh, right. Yeah. So I think so when I arrived at Penn, I wanted to keep doing something with biology, because I had been working at this place where I was helping out in the lab, and everyone was kind of doing a bit of everything. And despite my terrible grades in biology classes in college, I still wanted to do a bit of biology. So I took a couple of graduate classes in biology, evolution, and ecology, and basically went and knocked on biologist doors until I found one that was keen to have a philosopher hanging out in their lab.
It can take a bit sometimes with some scientists, but
they were all really nice. But I remember being asked, "So what lab skills do you have?" and saying, "Oh, well, none really." But Paul Sniegowski let me start working in my lab in my second year of my PhD, I think.
Nice.
And so his lab works on long-term experimental evolution of microbes, mostly E. coli and yeast. So basically evolving microbes in the lab for a long time and studying their mutation rates and other evolutionary stuff. So I started out literally washing dishes there, and then ended up taking over a PhD student's project as he was trying to finish up, helping him with some experiments. And
nice.
It was just great. It was just a lot of fun working in the lab and having something hands-on to do every day. And that kind of gave rise to my thesis topic, I guess, which was it was about experimental evolution, in the sense that was my main source of examples, but it was more philosophically about the relationship between experiments and models. So challenging the idea, which a few people had challenged before in different ways, but challenging the idea that there's some kind of epistemic privilege that experiments have over models. And I thought experimental evolution kind of grabbed my attention as a test case for that, because it's using model organisms, which many people think are models, right? But it's an experiment. You're manipulating things in the lab. But in some ways, it's a model too, because you're using it as a stand-in for, human evolution, all animal evolution, all evolution period, but just looking at these really, really simple bacteria. So it made me think about kind of challenging or blurring the line between experiments and models in various ways.
Fascinating. And so perhaps in a brief way, so what do we gain, and what did you find to be pertinent in terms of defending or arguing for a view of understanding models as experiments, etc.?
Right. Yeah. I guess it was less about saying all models are experiments or some experiments are models, and more just about challenging the idea that we can point to the methodology of some particular case of research, like this is an experiment or this is a model, and use that alone as the basis for some epistemic judgment about what we can learn from it. It was a big part of it was responding to an earlier paper by Mary Morgan, who was great to talk to as I was writing my thesis. She's I really admired her paper, but also disagreed with part of it, which was a nice starting point for writing a chapter that I ended up writing a paper about later. But her view was basically had to do with the idea that there's some kind of material correspondence between the experimental system and the world outside the experimental system. And that gives some sort of extra epistemic weight to the claims that you can make from experiments compared to models where there isn't that material correspondence. And so I was basically trying to challenge that idea, not saying it's always wrong, but it's not a generalization we can make about experiments and models, because it doesn't always work that way.
What might have been an instance where it doesn't work that way?
Well, I think there are cases like from experimental evolution, for example, where I'm not sure we can totally make sense of the idea of material correspondence. So if we're trying to say something, so one of the examples that I talked about had to do with big claims about punctuated evolutionary dynamics from experimental microbial evolution. So if we think about the stuff we're studying in the lab and the stuff in the world we're trying to say something about, which many people call the target or target system, the thing we're studying is a bunch of E. coli in test tubes. And in some cases, the target system is E. coli in nature. That seems like something we could call material correspondence. We have to fill out what we mean by material, but intuitively that seems to work. But if the thing we're trying to say something about is an evolutionary dynamic, like punctuated evolution, we're not saying it about any particular species or any particular system that it's in. We're just saying something about a dynamic. And then I think it's hard to say anything much about material correspondence apart from the fact that E. coli are living, and we're probably trying to say something about something else that's living.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's very fascinating. How did Dr. Morgan respond?
Oh, I mean, I'm trying to remember. I know I talked to her about this as it was work in progress. I gave a few talks on it that she was at, and she was always really helpful in discussing these ideas. I wish I remembered the details of the conversation a bit more, but yeah, she gave me really, really great feedback, and
it sounds very supportive and yeah, contributing to the literature. Great. Okay, so no, it sounds like a great project. And so in working and completing on this, how did so I imagine, in working in this was what came next in your trajectory? Were you interested in going on to continue in academia? Were you interested in returning to I suppose high level industry of some way? What were your interests?
Oh yeah, so by the second or third year of my PhD, I was totally set on trying to get an academic job.
Yeah.
It's funny, when I started my PhD, I don't even know how I got into grad school. I just shake my head thinking about this now. But in my sort of personal statement, I remember I wrote something like, I'm not sure what I want to do after my PhD. I don't think I want an academic career. I might want an academic career. Now I know you're not supposed to say that in your application to PhDs, but
I think you're not alone in the sentiment, though. I mean, but that's.
I was honest, yeah.
Yeah.
But no, yeah. So I very much wanted to try to get an academic job. So I was trying to publish things and go to conferences, and did a lot of that my last few years. And then I went on the job market my 5th year of grad school, I guess, and ended up here in Auckland.
Fantastic. So you've been teaching, and I noticed I was just looking over the CV. You've had a few great positions overseas as well. So a little bit at ANU, but then I don't know if was there anything from those years that was, I don't know, interesting or important in your development?
Oh yeah. So I mentioned like ANU and ASU are in my CV as places that I was a visiting fellow, but that was all either during my PhD or during my time at Auckland.
Wow.
So I never had jobs there. It was just visiting.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Connected with the people.
Yeah. So I came basically straight from my PhD to here.
Okay. So, and, so how have things been, we've learned a little bit about, the co-teaching of the courses, but, so what is it like to study and to do philosophy of science in Auckland, in New Zealand?
It's really great. And it's great in ways that I wasn't expecting when I came here. I talked to a lot of people when I applied for, and then especially when I got offered the job here. I had never been to New Zealand before I moved here. I had spent time in Australia, and my partner's from New Zealand, so I had reasons to think that I would like it here. But I had never actually been here. And I had a lot of people, especially in North America, kind of giving me cautionary words about being isolated, like being this far away in the world, and
Sure.
not being able to get to all the conferences as easily and that sort of thing. But I mean, obviously the pandemic has screwed that up for everyone in various ways. But before then, it's a great place to be. Like before the pandemic started, I was managing to get back to North America twice a year for PSA and other big things. But also there's an amazing philosophy of biology community, especially in Australia, and a few people here. So it's not really nice being closer to that and able to get over to Australia more often.
Well, I know. So in looking, obviously there's when we were talking about philosophy of science or in philosophy in general, generally a lot of the universities that come about are, Australian National University, University of Sydney, Melbourne, would in Auckland sort of, is there somewhat of a loose connection amongst scholars and researchers in that region that you would, the community in general would, I'm not sure, go to the same conferences, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a few kind of, there's the Australasian Association of Philosophy and the New Zealand Association of Philosophy, and a couple of more phil-bio focused workshops that happen where the philosophers of biology from Australia and New Zealand get together. And yeah, I mean, but another thing that is really great about being here that is kind of the flip side of the isolation point people were sort of making was I was worried about coming somewhere where I'd be the only philosopher of science. I took over basically from Robert Nola, who was a philosopher of science who retired the year I came. So I'm the only philosopher of science at my university. And I was thinking, that'll be rough compared to some of the other places I'd applied for jobs where I would have been part of a cohort. Sure. And it's actually been incredible for me, especially as an early career person being the go-to philosopher of science at my university. I've had to really practice getting good at saying no to things because I mentioned the biology course that I co-teach, but I also teach in 4 other science courses now.
Wow.
And it's just like 1 lecture per semester usually, but sometimes a bit more. And it's great being the sort of resident philosopher of science that in a place where a lot of scientists are actually really keen to talk to philosophers, which is cool. I feel like that's not the case at every university, but it's there's a lot of that going on here, and it's an exciting place to be. Yeah,
I appreciate you sharing that. I would say, the positive outlook on that. I know that is a concern with other early career folks especially in thinking about wanting an academic job, but realizing that there's only maybe, 10 to 15 universities with like a philosophy of science focus almost, with like a cohort where there's probably more than 3 philosophers of science at that particular university. And like we could probably count them on one hand, but, probably less than 10 in the US. And then as we expand to the remaining of the world, maybe around 20 or something. But there's a whole lot more philosophy departments where you're going to have folks in ethics, political philosophy, metaethics, and you're just the standalone. However, those who have taken that, I've found, one, it's really great to hear that the scientists there are extraordinarily warm, but also that I've seen like it motivates people to kind of get moving, to connect with others outside in other associations, to maintain those associations that perhaps they made in graduate school or postdocs and things like that. And so it's cool. I'm glad to hear that your experience has been, I guess more encouragingly supportive and or the not isolating is what I'm trying to get at. So that's really cool. That's really cool to hear. So I'm interested. So you've been there for a bit, and you've mentioned a little bit about returning to some of your earlier interests. But why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're currently up to or recently been up to in some of your research and ideas and projects, and what's been going on?
Yeah, I've got a few at the moment. I mean, since I came here, a lot of my research has really been driven by collaborations. I didn't do much collaborative publishing, or yeah, I guess I didn't do any during my PhD because I was just focused on trying to get single authored publications out, which was probably a good idea.
I can tell you did a pretty good job, not gonna lie. Yeah, but
thanks. But yeah, I guess shortly after I came here, I went to a workshop in Australia that Maureen O'Malley had organized at Sydney. And I had always been a huge admirer for work. And we both gave talks at that workshop about model organisms and said some kind of interestingly complementary things. And she asked if I wanted to write a paper together, and I was very flattered. And we did, and then we've written a few other things together since then. And that was just an absolutely amazing experience collaborating with her and still collaborating with her, but also just made me realize that I love writing things in collaboration with other people. So I've been trying to do that more and more. I just find it's a great way to get research done, at least the way my brain works, just being able to have someone that you're working together with on ideas. And also when you get the writer's block, instead of just simmering in that, you can flick it to the other person and they send it back with new stuff. And it's great.
Well, it's so interesting, as someone who came from science, research in science and being in labs before getting into philosophy of science, it seems like everything is generally done as a team. There might be some solo projects that you're definitely, heading on, but eventually everything kind of comes to collaborate. And so it's just historically, yeah, it's interesting how a lot of the humanities, history, philosophy are generally done, or there's still like a professional value of, I suppose, demonstrating individual work, which I think definitely has merit, but it's also just way more fun to do things with other people, I think. It can be and helpful, not just for the experience of it, but just in developing the project. But I know in early career, it's right. One of the concerns, and I think I imagine someone, or perhaps you had this, you would do this intuitively, is that getting those single author publications is like key, like really important. So,
so I'm working on, so Maureen and I did a bunch of stuff together about microbiome research and microbiology.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm working on at the moment, or just is under review right now, but Anya Plutinsky and I wrote a paper together about cancer in the microbiome. So she's done all this amazing work in philosophical issues about cancer and wrote this great book about explaining cancer. And a couple of the papers I wrote with Maureen, also with Kate Lynch at Sydney, had to do with how causally complicated and problematic microbiome-based explanations are. So Anya and I have just finished this paper about the sort of perfect causal storm of bringing together microbiome-based explanations and explanations of cancer. So there's a whole bunch of people right now trying to explain basically every element of human health, mental and physical, in terms of the microbiome. And it gets especially complicated with cancer because cancer is already quite hard to explain, and microbiomes are a tough basis for explaining things. So we looked at a bunch of literature on that and have a paper where we try to tease out some of the sort of trade-offs in, are we trying to explain something versus develop treatments that work? And are we trying to get a sort of fine-grained causal factor versus just something coarse-grained that works? So yeah, we look at a bunch of kind of trade-offs and causal issues there.
Very interesting. And so are they primarily, would you say, like looking at explanations in medicine, or is it also in more just microbiology more generally?
Yeah, I mean, in that case, it's mostly, I guess, biomedical researchers trying to figure out whether there's some connection between our microbiota and cancer initiation or progression, or, can we do something to tweak people's microbiomes to either treat cancer or slow its progression and so forth. Yeah, so that's been a fun project. I'm still interested in doing more work on microbiology. But the other kind of, well, oh gosh, I don't even know where to start. I'm working on 3 more things right now. I don't know how much time we have, but one of the other.
We got a few. We got a little bit of time. We were probably about 10 minutes or so, but to keep in time.
So I'm working on a short book project, one of the Cambridge Elements. So it's a sort of short monograph on the nature of life, on the debate about defining life and what's the difference between the living and the non-living. And that was this topic I have been interested in for a while. And I've written a few things about it, more kind of in philosophy of microbiology. I wrote a paper during my PhD about the discovery of arsenic bacteria in 2010. And like, could that really tell us anything about the nature of life or not? And I argued that not really in any deep way. But yeah, I've kind of had this ongoing interest in the nature of life and, this 2,000-year-old philosophical debate about that, but specifically its relevance to science. And I guess that kind of obviously comes from my work at Protolife and thinking about all these people trying to create life from scratch in the lab. Should they care when they've crossed the threshold to life? Is there a threshold to life, or is it just a very gradual gray area with no real threshold? How does the answer to that question actually matter to the scientists, or does it? So I still like thinking about that stuff. And I've written a few book chapters in the last couple of years, trying to say something new about that debate from the perspective of different approaches to characterizing life. Like, are we trying to draw a line between 2 categories in a strict philosophical definition sense, or are we talking about something that's a matter of degree? Are we trying to characterize something that's a feature of individuals or a feature of collectives or populations of them? Are we trying to characterize something really minimal like a cell, or capture all of life or even the whole biosphere? So I'm looking at a bunch of aspects of how life is defined or characterized along those lines, and trying to say if and when they might matter to scientists invested in life, like astrobiologists or synthetic biologists.
Very interesting. And so in terms of what I take initially to perhaps be a descriptive project, I mean, are these the explanations or the ways in which individuals are teasing apart the definitions or conceptions of life? Are these from the scientists themselves? Are these philosophers of the science? Where are you drawing or looking toward?
Well, both. I guess philosophers and scientists have been arguing about this stuff for quite a long time. There was a paper a few years ago that did this kind of, one of those text analysis things that I think only tells you so much about how different the concepts are, but they counted 120 different proposed definitions of life in the literature.
Sounds probably right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm sure there's on the order of 100. And then some people like, Carol Cleland wrote a really nice book about this recently. Quite her and a few other people have done some quite nice, just overviews of the literature, grouping these definitions into families. So when I say there's around 100, it's not like they're all totally different from one another. There's some that focus on evolution and some that focus on metabolism, and then there's slight variations within those. But anyway, people have had a lot of different views on this. And I think it's an interesting question. And I think some people are sick of it, partly because it just seems like a debate that's been going on for a long time with no resolution. So
sure.
There's been some interesting papers in the last 10 years saying, hey, forget about this question, it's not interesting. Or saying we should just be pragmatic pluralists about it.
Sure, just many flowers bloom. Well, but you brought up an interesting part of at least describing them and perhaps finding. So what I'm interested perhaps is like, are there 1 or 2 instances that you think where considering these questions or providing some kind of a, I don't know, description or conception of life will matter to the science, the matter to how it's carried out, how it's understood, for us today or in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the starkest examples of that maybe come from astrobiology and synthetic biology, where in various ways, if there's no agreed upon understanding of what life is, forget about whether it's a definition or not, but some characterization or model or agreed upon account, there's no clear success condition. So finding life in the universe, there's people right now trying to find life on Mars, or the people are not on Mars, obviously, but there's instruments being sent to Mars trying to find evidence of life. And whether or not the scientists involved are actively participating in this philosophical debate about the nature of life, they've got assumptions about what life is driving that. And so in the late 70s, there were the Viking missions, and most people think that they didn't find life, but there's a few people who still to this day insist that they found evidence of life on those missions. And I think that debate exists because of the lack of a shared agreement about what life is.
Sounds interesting to me, but I haven't been studying for very long. So I imagine those who have read debate after debate about this. My only experience was taking a class on autopoiesis in cognitive science, and it was focused more on I suppose understanding minimal it was more like modeling for minimal agent-based modeling to understand the basic constituents of a cell perhaps, or I'm not sure, but I don't know. That might be where does autopoiesis fall into these kinds of discussions?
Yeah, great. I've actually been trying to learn more about autopoiesis myself because I've heard the word many times and know what it means, but there's been a lot of really interesting work on it.
There's some very cool folks
isn't Randy Beer at Indiana?
Yep. Yeah. So he was the one that taught the autopoiesis and enaction course, and he teaches out of, it's like informatics, but also complex systems and cognitive science. So it had a cog sci bet, but we read the Matrona Varela works and things, and it's some pretty out there stuff, but it was, I had no point of reference too. That was the first introduction to questions of life. So I was actually going to say the best take I've heard on autopoiesis that made me understand and appreciate the idea better was he visited Auckland a few years ago and gave a really great talk on modeling and life and autopoiesis. Yeah, cool. Yeah. So I
want to take that class.
Yeah, it's fun. I'm sure Randy's a great guy. I'm sure it'd be great to hear from him. Well, I know we're running short on time, so thank you so much for sharing about your current projects and your foray back into the questions that got you really started, so your fascinating early career. Why don't we conclude with the last question related to more broad scope philosophy of science, as what do you take to be the biggest challenge facing philosophers of science today?
Yeah, I always find the biggest challenge questions hard because I'm not sure there's just one, but but yeah, I've listened to a few of your other podcasts and heard people say something that I would just echo about, finding ways to really be relevant to scientists and relevant to society, in addition to engaging with our own internal debates that we care about as philosophers. That's something that I think about quite a bit, is how can I do things that are relevant and ideally helping change the world, if not fix the world. But yeah, maybe rather than spending a bunch of time echoing that, I guess, maybe just quickly two other things that come to mind.
Sure.
And one is a problem that I think is one of the biggest challenges for philosophy, not just philosophy of science, but is just there's so many talented people going through grad school and coming up, and so relatively few academic jobs in philosophy of science. So what next? What next for everyone if they don't get the academic job, or if they don't want an academic job? And I think it would be really cool to see more opportunities for philosophers of science to go into science communication. There's a lot of people doing really great science communication work here in New Zealand and in Auckland, and kind of a strong culture around doing that well. And I've had a couple of really amazingly talented students interested in science communication in the last few years, and I've been kind of steering them towards hey, do a double major in philosophy of science and a science. And I just think I think that's a cool career path. I don't have the answer to like how to make more of those careers for people, but I guess just generally being open-minded and creating opportunities for people to use their philosophy of science skills in contexts outside standard academic jobs.
Well, perhaps I'm not. Maybe I've seen folks on Twitter who are in like SciComm and science communication, and they definitely have experience as, first and foremost, almost philosophers of science. Probably there's some in SciComm that are, come from neighboring, I don't know, sociology of science or maybe just science in general. But be cool to see some representation of science communication at like the PSA or something, or some other places that would introduce to that, because I'm pretty sure, a lot of PhD programs are not pitching science communication as a viable, not necessarily not viable, they just don't know about it. They just don't really talk about it so much. But perhaps, I imagine maybe some of the big ones now are making people more aware, but you're absolutely right. The issue is you have a lot of smart, bright, talented minds, and it's true that it's not everyone's going to get a position, or perhaps in the time that they need, practically speaking. So what can be done, and what could help to change the world a little bit more in meaningful ways, coming with the backgrounds that we have. So it's a big challenge. So
yeah. And the one other challenge I wanted to just briefly mention, which is no, it's okay. It's just I'd be curious to hear what you think, actually, but it's more of a teaching challenge, but it's I constantly struggle with this in my undergrad and grad philosophy of science courses. Like, there's all these classic problems that we're supposed to know about as philosophers of science, and it's important to know about them. Like, I think I'd be doing my students a disservice if they graduated from here and had never heard of white ravens and black ravens and Kuhnian revolutions. And it's not like they need to know everything, but there's some things that we're supposed to know. But there's also so much cool new work, and philosophers of science are increasingly engaging with these relevant, interesting topics. How to communicate well about science, the relationship between scientific and local or indigenous knowledge, which is another thing I'm starting to work on here in collaboration with people. And those are just two examples among like 100 of relatively new topics to philosophers of science that I think I would like to be teaching more in my classes. So I always find that hard. How do we train people in enough of the classics, so to speak, that they've got the basic framework as future philosophers of science, but also expose them to all these really exciting new things that you can do as a philosopher of science, engaging more with the public, or more with like up-to-date hot scientific work.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that. I'll just briefly, I think I just interviewed someone that actually, it seemed like they tend to they're like, oh, I teach intro to philosophy of science, and it sounds like they don't teach any of the old stuff, or like not even old stuff, but the classic problems, because there's just so much exciting new things to get to. But that's being said, it feels, there's something about learning Hopos, the history of philosophy of science, that helps to understand perhaps the questions. But I don't know. I think you're onto something, that teaching and exposing students and ourselves as researchers to new ideas and new ways of communicating about what philosophy of science is about. And it's not just this history of different approaches, which is interesting, but right. It could be just simply a matter of not enough, time, of how much time we have to teach these courses. You only have students for a couple semesters. Maybe you have a minor in phil sci. But I think it would be cool is to see more of exactly what you were referring to, these unique unique approaches to science, more of science and values classes, more, that's what I think is going to excite folks the most. And but I don't know, if circle back if you come up with a solution, or like be interested to hear if you guys I don't know if you have like a minor or a concentration program and how that gets decided. But I think hopefully we start to see more of the contemporary current stuff that philosophers of science are doing, because that's what I find exciting. I think that's what most practicing philosophers of science find exciting anyway. So
totally, yeah. And that's what I've been leaning towards, is teaching more of the new exciting stuff and then bringing in the stuff that I feel like they should know along the way in lecture. So instead of spending half the semester reading stuff from the 20th century, I'll say, hey, there was this guy who had this really important idea, and I'm going to tell you about it because it's relevant to today's topic.
I mean, it's one thing for like, if you're doing grad and quals and there's like a, that base knowledge for the grad students. But if you're getting undergrads in there getting excited, I think that's, you only have so much time. I think that approach is really strong. So, but well, good luck with that, and good luck with the bio grad students. And thank you so much for taking the time. Have a wonderful day in Auckland. Enjoy. Good luck. Good luck starting up the new term.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Nice talking to you.
Nice talking to you too, Emily. Take care.